Today, there are dangers around us we cannot allow to prevail. We here, you've heard it, more and more talk about violence as an acceptable political tool.
The shameful raid and break-in of my home, Mar-a-Lago, was a travesty of justice that made a mockery of America's laws, traditions, and principles before the entire world. The entire world was watching, and they're shocked. They're shocked.
As the U.S. Department of Justice considers its next move in the criminal investigation of a former president, Joe Biden and Donald Trump continue to trade accusations as tensions run high. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. After an FBI raid of his Florida residence last month, the legal case against former President Donald Trump appears stronger than ever. The FBI has revealed that it removed dozens of highly classified documents, including 18 that were marked top secret, 54 that were labeled secret, and 31 identified as confidential, after months of reported negotiations with his lawyers to retrieve the documents. The seized items at Mar-a-Lago also included dozens of empty folders, 48 marked classified and 42 labeled Return to Staff Secretary Military Aid, and over 11,000 unclassified documents. On Monday, a Trump-appointed judge granted the former president's request for a special master to conduct an independent review of the documents, which has been widely regarded as a delay tactic to stall the investigation ahead of the midterms. Meanwhile, President Biden has attempted to tone down his sharp rhetoric toward the former president and his supporters, whom he described in a speech last week in Philadelphia as extreme Republicans, denouncing them as a threat to American democracy.
I don't consider any Trump supporter to be a threat to the country. I do think anyone who calls for the use of violence, fails to condemn violence when it's used, refuses to acknowledge when an election has been won, insists upon changing the way in which the rules you count votes. That is a threat to democracy.
Biden also described Trump's Make America Great Again philosophy as, quote, semi-fascism. Trump, who's been holding campaign rallies to shore up support for his Republican allies running in the November midterm elections, has used Biden's attacks against him and his followers to promote the notion that he is the victim of political persecution, despite evidence that he may have violated the 1978 Presidential Records Act by retaining presidential records and moving classified material from the White House. Joining me now is Jeffrey Clark, a former top Department of Justice official who served as Assistant Attorney General during the Trump administration. Jeffrey Clark, you have long defended Donald Trump and his claims that the 2020 election had been stolen from him. I know you pleaded the Fifth Amendment, apparently more than 100 times in interviews with the January 6th Congressional Committee, refusing to answer most, if not all, of their questions. Now, federal investigators conducted a search of your home back in June. That was a couple of months before the FBI searched the Florida home of former President Trump. Yet you've continued to refuse to cooperate with law enforcement and continue to push the largely discredited theory that the election was indeed stolen. Is that the most important challenge that the U.S. faces today? President Biden himself described the whole MAGA philosophy as semi-fascism. Does he have a strong point?
Well, Ghida, there are a lot of questions embedded in there, and thanks for having me. But first, I have to correct, I think, some of your premises. So I have not long taken positions in terms of President Trump's positions on the election. I was at the Justice Department at the time, and my duties were of a more neutral nature to investigate, to do what I was called upon by the president. And then as to the suggestion that you made—
But hold on. No, let me just take you on this point. I mean, there is clearly a lot of documentation and evidence that was presented in a Senate Judiciary Committee report, a 2021 report that shows that you became, quote unquote, Trump's big lie lawyer, pressuring colleagues in the Department of Justice to force them to overturn the election. In fact, you circulated a draft proposal that you tried to get other DOJ officials to sign on to that was going to interfere with the Georgia certification process. You also cast doubt over the election results in other states. Doesn't that constitute an attempt to deny the peaceful transfer of power?
Ghida, it seems to me almost as if you're proceeding in an ambush-like fashion here, and that you also haven't done very good research. Have you read the letters that my counsel sent to the January 6th committee? There's an extensive body of letters. It's up on their website.
But could you address the points that I've just made then?
Well, the letters address those points, and I don't want to get into a tit for tat with you here. It seems like you're actually trying to lead me into something that would be inconsistent with my invocation of several privileges. Let me enumerate them for you. First, you mentioned the fifth, but that's actually the last one that I stood on. First, I invoked executive privilege because I have a letter from the president, also law enforcement privilege, and then attorney-client privilege. So those are the reasons why you're trying to paint it as if I'm not cooperating, but I'm actually adhering to the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution's separation of powers in the positions that I've taken.
Let me ask you this then. You and other pro-Trump supporters have been accusing the Department of Justice of quote-unquote weaponizing government because of their pursuit of search warrants at the home of the former president. But looking at this criminal investigation facing Donald Trump, is there any doubt that he actually broke the law by taking thousands of documents home with him after he left the White House in violation of a well-established, decades-old law?
Well, in the United States, Ghida, we have something called the presumption of innocence. And I have not certainly reached a point where I think it's beyond dispute, as you're trying to say. Just recently, the judge who has the equitable case that President Trump's lawyers brought, Judge Cannon, held that a special master should be appointed to review the documents that the Justice Department is looking at. And inherent in that is that the investigation is not complete. So I think it puts the cart before the horse to imagine that, you can say that, that there's some crime here that was committed. I know that that's the regular standard fare each night on MSNBC, CNN, and other fake news outlets, but it's just not the reality of where we are in the process.
Hold on, Mr. Clark. No one is saying that, but your own former boss, the former Trump-appointed Attorney General, William Barr, has said that the appointment of a special master to investigate the documents that were seized at Mar-a-Lago was indeed, or in fact, in his words, a red herring, that there was absolutely no need to appoint such an independent investigator when the government itself had already reviewed all the documents.
Just because Bill Barr says something doesn't make it true and doesn't mean that I have to agree with it.
It doesn't mean you have to agree with him, but do you agree with him on the point that the DOJ had no choice but to conduct a search warrant, given the fact that in his words, they were being jerked around, and he says, how long do they wait?
I vehemently disagree with that, Ghida, because what we're talking about is the Presidential Records Act, which is a civil statute. And what the Justice Department is trying to do here is essentially bolt into that statute multiple other statutes so that those statutes can serve as an enforcement mechanism for the Presidential Records Act. Congress didn't write the Presidential Records Act that way. If the archives wanted to use the Presidential Records Act as a civil matter, and that's why the negotiations were taking place, they could have done so. What they've done that's unprecedented, in addition to the unprecedented step of raiding a former president's house in the first place, is that they have this legal theory that I've described before as a Frankenstein-like monster where they bolted together multiple statutes and they're pretending as if it's an integrated whole, and it's simply not.
Well, it's all very well to use the word unprecedented, but again, Bill Barr says, quote, it's also unprecedented for a president to take all this classified information and put them in a country club, not to mention the dozens of empty folders that were marked classified. I mean, that's a lot of empty folders. As a former DOJ official, isn't that concerning to you? Wouldn't you at the very least want to know what happened to these missing documents?
Well, I think it's odd, as I pointed out on Twitter, that we're talking about empty folders. I mean, it really just shows that the mainstream media is in a kind of frenzy to get Donald Trump. First it's, well, there might be nuclear secrets, but there are no indications of, from what I've seen, of any Q classification documents. And I held a Q clearance in the Justice Department, as well as top secret clearance, SCI clearance, several compartments about HUMINT and the like. So I know about this. And, I think that, in this instance, that we're talking about a country club. It's a flippant statement by former Attorney General Barr, but it's a country club that's under Secret Service protection and supervision. And indeed, the archives and lawyers representing them had been out to Mar-a-Lago, and they had insisted on putting another lock on the facility. And yet they staged an unannounced raid, and then they cut the very lock that they had insisted be put on. It seems internally contradictory, to say the very least, Ghida.
Well, semantics aside, whether it's called a country club or a resort, this was a public place, where guests and staffers had easy access, one might imagine. If a Democrat had been accused of the same crime and shown to have broken the law, would you have called for their prosecution?
Hillary Clinton was found by James Comey, the former director of the FBI, to have had multiple categories of classified materials and emails on a server that it's likely that foreign countries accessed. And yet, he pronounced that there would be no prosecution of that. Indeed, even though it wasn't his role, he said no reasonable prosecutor would pursue that. I think that's a situation that you're not accounting for, even if you want to make arguments about the even-handed application of justice.
It was never on the same level, and you know that as well as I do. If national security secrets were indeed compromised, should the president, at the time, the former president, face the consequences of his actions? Because both Republican and Democratic administrations have indicted low-level government employees and senior officials who've walked out of secure government buildings with just one piece or two pieces of secret information. Why shouldn't the same principle apply to a former president, whoever they may be? Well, we seem to have lost our connection. That was Jeffrey Clark, a former Department of Justice official under President Trump. As with almost everything regarding Donald Trump, the latest poll numbers show Republicans and Democrats split over whether the former president actually broke the law. 64% of Americans think the allegations against Trump over his handling of classified documents after leaving the White House are either very serious or somewhat serious, with 86% of Democrats saying that former President Trump should be prosecuted on criminal charges, while 83% of Republicans say he should not. With midterm elections less than 2 months away, the Department of Justice and the FBI are keen to avoid allegations of political interference. Joining me now is former FBI agent and congressional candidate Coleen Rowley. Coleen Rowley, you are a former FBI agent. You're also a Democrat who has serious reservations and concerns about the way the criminal investigation into Donald Trump has been going. Explain why.
Well, we don't really know the actual factual justification for this search because the affidavit, when it was released, it was mostly blacked out. And sometimes that can even be more misleading. Our mainstream media has been, spinning a lot of things, in fact, over the last 6 years. So it's very hard to know if it actually was justified, the search. However, I do think you have to put this into context of the last 6 years, which began with this Russiagate hoax that was made up by the Democratic candidate campaign. The FBI, piled on. They went to the FISA judge with false information, 4 times, in fact. And so even the Inspector General for the Department of Justice was quite alarmed about this polarization and politicization of the FBI. FBI, by the way, is not the only agency nor the only the actors that have had this, Trump derangement syndrome. But I think the conclusion that we can, have consensus with is in this war of the FBI, again, it's not just the FBI versus Trump, the public, the American public is the big loser. I think
but hold on, though, Coleen Rowley, what makes you believe that this investigation is indeed politically motivated? The former Attorney General who served under Trump himself has said that the FBI had no other alternatives but to conduct the raid because of the way Team Trump had been misleading the Department of Justice, refusing to surrender the documents that they had taken?
Well, that's half of the story. And as a former FBI agent, I know that when you are in a trial, you get both sides to the story. So certainly Garland, his version is that this was justified and that the Trump lawyers were not cooperating. That could be true. I don't know. Again, the public doesn't know these things because we really have not been privy to all of the facts.
But I'm not talking about Merrick Garland solely. I'm talking about Bill Barr, the former Attorney General, who is on the record saying that the FBI was justified in conducting this raid. I mean, many on the right, including members of Congress, have been accusing the FBI of planting evidence at Trump's Florida resort. Just how far-fetched is this scenario?
Well, it does aid the narrative that some of the Republican actors like Barr have actually, agreed with Garland. That actually bolsters it quite a lot. And it makes it seem less politicized. However, I do think you have to go back to the last 6 years. And I do think that when you saw emails at the highest levels of the FBI about we're going to have to, take Trump down, you've seen some of this dirty laundry come out over 6 years. And especially that I think I was most alarmed because having taught constitutional law and the knowledge about the FISA process, when the FBI actually put the Steele dossier as their main probable cause for continued surveillance of one of Trump's volunteer aides. So that was alarming. And I don't think you can just sweep that under the rug and say that everything has changed now. I think you have to as an analyst, I think you have to look at all the facts. And yeah, if Barr thinks this is justified, maybe it was. Here's one other reason why I'm a little suspicious.
Sure.
Can I just say one more reason why I'm suspicious? Is that this has become so polarized. When you start saying that someone is violating the Espionage Act, okay, the Espionage Act is accusing Trump of being a traitor to the country, like an Aaron Burr. I mean, in the history, we have not had very many of these times, especially no time when a president has been called to be violating the Espionage Act. And I think this ratchets it up to a degree that makes it more suspicious, like it's basically part of the same old Russiagate that we've been, has been happening for 5-6 years now.
You mentioned Russiagate and you mentioned the Steele dossier, which was written at the time and was presented in 2016 during the campaign, written by a former MI6 counterintelligence official paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the DNC. That was then, this is now, though. I mean, has it dented the FBI's credibility to the extent that they are no longer justified to pursue this case here against Trump? I mean, the FBI have taken this unprecedented step of searching the home of a former president. Would they have done it if they didn't have strong enough evidence?
Well, again, going back just a few years, I don't think you can just separate and say everything has changed. It's true, the FBI lost credibility for what it did in going against Trump. And by the way, they started it's not just that FISA surveillance, false statements made to the FISA court. It's also the fact that they opened 2 counterintelligence investigations against Trump that we don't know what they were based on. It seems very flimsy. They might have been based on the Steele dossier as well.
But today, though, what makes you believe that the investigation is so politically motivated? I mean, do you have reason to believe that it is driven by politics and not the law, not the facts, that the FBI isn't conducting this solely based on the evidence?
Well, again, I'm just like anyone else. We don't know what the facts were. I do think it's the question is the FBI has not really reestablished its credibility since really, and this has been a continuous thing. This hasn't just been a one time they started a counterintelligence investigation targeting Trump. This has been an ongoing thing. There's also the fact that the FBI has done a lot of entrapping, certainly in the war on terror. They've been setting up stings So there's a lot more than just the Trump thing. There's a lot of things where the FBI has lost credibility. I think what they should do in order to regain credibility is come clean about everything and then try to start over. I mean, I agree with you. It's really a sad moment in time when people are so suspicious, and I'm certainly not the only one. And where the public is the big loser is this polarization that has occurred where opposing power-mongering candidates accuse each other under the Espionage Act. That really just polarizes the entire country. And in fact, many people are saying this is something that shouldn't be happening in the United States, that we shouldn't have this.
Both sides are using it to their advantage. In fact, following the raid on Mar-a-Lago, the polls have shown that Trump actually had a 10-point boost over his most likely rival, and he was able to quickly raise about $1 million in just a matter of 2 days. So clearly, both sides are able to capitalize on this. But going back a little bit to a couple of decades ago, when you blew the whistle against the FBI in congressional testimony for its failings in the lead up to 9/11, do you believe the FBI today, when it comes to Donald Trump, hasn't been acting in good faith?
Unfortunately, since 9/11, there's this notion that you can, and in fact, public officials have said this, we don't have to worry about facts or reality. We can make our own reality. And I think that actually was the case of why I spoke out about the fact that the FBI was not telling the truth about the failures that led to 9/11. They were sweeping that all under the rug. It's a long history now of 20 some years where the war on terror said, okay, everything's legal and everything's fair in war. Truth is the first casualty. We can make our own reality. And our media tends to go with that. Unfortunately, it really has polarized the United States, and no one really knows the complete facts. And in fact, many of the leaders don't seem to care about the actual truth or facts.
But regardless of classification status, one thing is clear, is that government documents belong to the American people and need to be sent to the National Archives when a president steps down and leaves office. That clearly hasn't happened. Should the president be indicted? You say there should be consequences. What kind of consequences should there be?
I think, again, he should perhaps be charged, certainly investigated for having retained these documents. And then the public should learn how secret they were, how important they were. In fact, they're doing an investigation right now to see what possible dangers or risks to national security occurred, which is fine. That's all good. I think the special master that has been appointed to check to see how many of these documents are privileged, attorney-client, all of this is good. And I would hope that the more information would come out to the public so that we can make these kinds of conclusions. I think it is too early, though, to conclude on one side or the other as to who is right here, just because we don't know the facts. And unfortunately, we have been in a context now in the last several years of really, and it's caused a lack of credibility to a lot of national security agencies, including the FBI. And I think this needs to be remedied with more full disclosure to the public. Otherwise, we're just going to see more polarization. You're going to see the Trump base accusing the government of unfairly targeting Trump. You're going to see the liberal side saying that Trump is a traitor under the Espionage Act. And both of those extremes may well be wrong. And we just need to get more information about this. Hopefully the media will do a better job, because right now they're just kind of skewing it one side or the other.
All right. Coleen Rowley, former FBI special agent, former congressional candidate, and 9/11 whistleblower who was named as one of Time Magazine's Persons of the Year in 2002. Pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.
The U.S. appears more divided today than ever. Opinion polls suggest 2/3 of Americans are concerned about political violence. More than half believe the country will be less of a democracy in the coming years. It's against this tense backdrop that the Department of Justice is holding back on prosecuting a former president. It knows how sensitive the timing is, less than 60 days from crucial midterm elections. and with senior Republican lawmakers warning that there will be riots in the streets if Donald Trump is indicted, the criminal case against him may be losing steam, despite what could be damning evidence gathered by the Department of Justice and the FBI. While Trump denounces investigators as vicious monsters and calls Biden the enemy of the state, the decision by the White House to go on the offensive could backfire. By calling the former president's MAGA followers extreme Republicans who pose a grave threat to democracy, Biden may have made it more difficult for the DOJ to convince a skeptical public that its investigation is impartial. He now has the difficult task of isolating Trump's MAGA followers from mainstream Republicans and defending himself against accusations that he is dividing and disparaging millions of Americans. And so, in short, Biden's risky strategy may have given Trump the opportunity he'd been looking for to paint himself and those who voted for him in 2020 as victims of a political establishment that considers them enemies of the state. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.